Hi, today we're going to take a look at Margaret Heffernan's Willful Blindness, a book published a couple of years ago, 2011. It's really a great book for and including for people interested in climate change, which is our primary focus here. But it basically joins a series of books that I would tend to really recommend for people who are interested in climate change, but where the books don't necessarily have anything directly to do with climate change. They have to do with communications, they have to do with psychology, they have to do with how we think about problems and manage problems. And that's really the big issue we face with climate change as opposed to necessarily more data or more science. And so that's the focus of taking a look at Margaret's book today. Obviously, it's going to be a very quick look. This is a standard book, quite lengthy. You can also find TED Talks from Margaret Heffernan and various other things on the web. She's written several different things. But this is particularly interesting from the standpoint of how we think about risk, how we think about our own behaviors, and it has a lot of ramifications for climate change, even though climate change only gets a paragraph in the book. So I'm going to run through parts of this very quickly, and certainly not go into a lot of detail. There's a lot more detail here that you'll see on the screen than I'll be able to relate. And I'll try and do it in three parts. One, why should I bother reading this book? Two, what will I learn to actually act on? Where do I go after I've read the book? And then just a few concluding words on the relevance of willful blindness for climate change. And since we're going to do this all in 6 or 7 minutes, it'll be relatively quick. So why should I bother reading this book? Two things there. Why is willful blindness important? What goes wrong when we ignore it? And second, do we understand it well enough to actually learn from it and extrapolate from it? And the book has a lot of great material in terms of what goes wrong when we ignore willful blindness and legal implications that came up in the Enron trial, where the judge said knowledge can be inferred if the defendant deliberately blinded himself to the existence of a fact. So that gives you sort of one angle into the whole willful blindness issue. Everyone tends to recognize willful blindness when they go looking for examples in whatever field you happen to be in. Pretty easy to find situations where it's clear that people are looking the other way intentionally, don't necessarily want to see what they want to see, and therefore don't see it. But the book also gives a whole series of very interesting examples of why it took 25 years for the medical profession to stop doing pediatric x-rays, even though it was pretty well established that there was a link to leukemia. The case of asbestos and W.R. Grace in Libby, Montana, and why it took 30 years. And even after 30 years and Superfund site, etc., you still have people in the town sort of trying to not recognize the problem. Tanning beds, a very interesting example where we know that tanning beds tend to double the risk of cancer, and yet there's a huge industry around tanning beds. Vioxx, some of the internal memos around Vioxx noting that the number of people likely dying from Vioxx was equivalent to two 747s full of people crashing every week, 52 weeks a year. And yet we managed to ignore a lot of the problems with Vioxx for quite a few years. So there are a lot of good examples of willful ignorance. But we also understand quite well why willful ignorance occurs. And one of the sort of obvious things here is that we're motivated to reason in ways that don't make us feel bad. We want to feel good about ourselves, we want to feel good about our surroundings, and our minds are quite capable of fitting the facts to the situation. And this is what's referred to here as motivated reasoning where we adjust what we know to avoid bad feelings of various kinds. And a huge amount of that goes on. There's plenty of examples of it. Unfortunately, we also know that in order to preserve our own sort of sense of self-worth in a lot of situations, we can lose sight of moral thinking. And there's interesting discussions of Abu Ghraib and interesting discussions of the mortgage crisis and why good people do seemingly very bad things in certain situations, and pointing out that it really isn't that the people are bad. It's many of us would fall into exactly the same traps if put into the same situation. And because the fact is, there are a lot of very good reasons for why we have this willful blindness. It serves a very specific purpose in our lives. The problem is that we then tend to make a lot of bad decisions. So jumping on to what will I learn to act on, one of the key points of the book, obviously, is that in general, we need a lot more of what Margaret refers to as Cassandras to help us buck the willful blindness. And she also lays out a series of steps that one can actually take in terms of, recognize how homogeneous in most cases our lives are and that we like it that way, acknowledge our biases, understand what our limitations are in various respects. From a corporate perspective, institutionalized dissent, something many companies obviously do not do, and it can be a very useful tool in terms of avoiding very bad outcomes. Remember history, don't run from complicated issues, ask whether our organizations are simply too complex to really be managed in the way we tend to manage. So she lays out in the final chapters some very interesting discussion of the steps that can be taken based on the book. So let me now just sort of wrap up with willful blindness and climate change. And it's a very short discussion in the book itself, although it does point out that climate change is, in some sense, the embodiment of almost everything having to do with willful blindness, which makes it particularly challenging. And you can come back and take a look at this short piece if you want. I did also have email contact with Margaret after reading the book, and saying, hey, do you have any great ideas in terms of applying this more directly to climate change and what to do about climate change? And her response wasn't overly positive, but none of us have been able to come up with the brilliant idea here, and so we need to basically just keep slogging it out and keep looking for one. So that's a quick review of Margaret Heffernan's Willful Blindness, and just to sort of remind you, if you haven't seen it before, software we're using here is Brain software, and you can see more information at our website at www.climatographer.com. And this software, and here's sort of one shot, is there are actually thousands and thousands and thousands of links in this software pulling all sorts of information together. In fact, the purpose of this Risk Brain is to help people figure out how to do better and to help generate dissonance by pulling together the right information for the right decision maker at the right time. And so we'd welcome your questions about that. I hope this has been useful. Thanks very much.